Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
But Tom Brady, when he won the Super Bowl, his wife Giselle at the time said one of the reasons he won is because she has these protection crystals that keep him safe. To the point where he was doing interviews being like, when I won the Super Bowl, oh, I'm so sorry, babe, when we won the Super Bowl. And I feel like girls say they believe in protection crystals, but if a guy was like, listen, I don't have a condom, but the good news, I have this protection crystal. I won't be able to walk you home, but I put a protection crystal in your purse. And you are going to want that, because some of the neighborhood guys also do crystal. So Tom Brady's wife, she lost all her money in crypto, too. And it was like, ladies, you don't get to be into girl crystals and guy crystals, you know what I mean? That's our crystal. Every guy puts 30% of his money in crypto, loses it, and that's how we close the wage gap. You're welcome.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Radical Saturday, October the 19th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, ideas have consequences, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and rules for radicals. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The most basic question is not what is best, but who shall decide what is best. Thomas Sowell. This is indeed the question. Defenders of free enterprise do not believe in a perfect administration under a market economy. Rather, we do not believe in the possibility of such. To the extent imperfect decision-making is accepted, we then seek to solve for who has the best chance of answering the question correctly, he with local knowledge or he without. He who will reap the consequences of his decision or he who will not. Better decisions that are imperfect are superior to worse ones that are also imperfect. And accountability where a decision is made is better than no accountability where a decision is also made. One simply must abandon belief in the omnipotent, disinterested third party, which no one explicitly believes in, but too many implicitly do. Once we have accepted the inevitability of imperfect decision-making, choosing who decides is the easy part.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now about 5 minutes of rules for radical conservatives.
Which is why you fools have a golden, hell, platinum opportunity to siphon off a huge voting bloc that you traditionally eschew. Minorities, who soon enough will be majorities. Teddy's little immigration bill made that inevitable. And soon enough, that day will be here. But remember this. Most of you conservatives vote for the party that was founded on freeing the slaves. You used to own their votes until we snatched them away from you during the Johnson-Nixon administration. As Nixon flipped the solid South from Democratic to Republican, blacks abandoned their traditional home in the GOP on the theory that the enemy of my enemy was my friend, and never came back. Still, that's no reason for you to surrender to our Brezhnev doctrine. What we liberals have done to the black community since the 1960s should be a national scandal. Through our vast panoply of soul-crushing, now there's a concept, social programs, enforced by unelected bureaucracies, and a public school system that makes the Western Front in World War I look like just another day in the trenches, we have destroyed black families, and we're working on white families now, encouraged what used to be called antisocial behavior, celebrated the worst regarding matters of mores, and generally turned a culture upside down, so that it is now ruled by gangstas. We swooped in like drug dealers, hooking the people on hopelessness, and at the same time promising to cure the very diseases we had spread around. The beauty of our plan, something we learned from the crooked politicians of the Chicago Machine and Tammany Hall, was that the cure for misery was always more misery, to keep the people in a state of permanent desperation and illusion, a never-ending cycle always spiraling downward. Sheer genius, really. The black middle class has of course fled the old neighborhoods, just like all the other groups before it. And what have we replaced it with? Metal detectors. So that's where you should be attacking us. Pin the tail on the donkey. You need a major talent recruitment drive, and one of the places it should start is at the historically black colleges like Howard, Morehouse, Bennett, etc. The great ones tend to be in the South, where the bulk of America's African-American population lived until World War II. And it is there, in the old, solid South, where the black conservative renewal is likely to begin. Nobody likes to be patronized, and we are nothing if not patronizing. So now's the time to act on decades of resentment. You have an audience that's very receptive to your message. For half a century, blacks in America have had their passions inflamed by us, and by us, I mean the editorial pages of the New York Times, even as barriers have fallen. Race hustlers have made whole careers out of, in effect, preying on their own people, using them as props in their ongoing shakedown operations of just about anything in America that's still breathing and has a penny in its pockets. There's a tide of honest resentment out there just waiting to be tapped, and the only thing that's holding it back is the media's mind control over the issue. Any black that steps off the plantation is hit and hit hard. Just ask Condoleezza Rice, just as Clarence Thomas, and just about any other black conservative, or even moderate, who dares not applaud when the race card is played. In a just universe, black intellectuals such as Thomas Sowell and Shelby Steele would be on the Times editorial board. So offer them more places at the table. Offer them places at the head of the table. Remember how a Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, electrified the black community when he invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him? And why? Not because the old Rough Rider was expiating collective guilt. On the contrary, TR was celebrating Washington's remarkable individual achievement. As a black man, yes, but as a man first and foremost. Washington's message of self-help and self-reliance has been out of favor practically since the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was Du Bois' baby, but it's long past time that Washington be given his due. An aggressive recruitment effort, starting at the elite black colleges, but also extending to the ranks of black military officers and enlisted men, can turn into a bumper crop of candidates before you know it. But whatever you do, avoid the whiff of tokenism. That's our job. Naming a failed candidate like Michael Steele to be the head of the Republican National Committee was a blatant bit of post-Obama Me Tooism that everybody could see through. Next time, think it through and get it right. But whatever you do, corollary number 2, mean it. Either you're all in this together or you're not. Either this unprecedented experiment works or it doesn't.
And that was Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rule 3 from Rules for Retrogrades.
Rule 3. No truth is off limits. We must never be ashamed to be candid. Radicals have successfully convinced many mod cons to self-censor, insisting that some truths are too offensive to be spoken in decent society. They've thus driven the retrograde message underground, forcing us to whisper in darkness a host of medicinal truths deserving of the limpid radiance of day. Should retrogrades continue to submit to such treacherous advice, we are destined to be routed in our fight for the soul of society. We know on the highest authority that apart from being desirable for its own sake, the truth shall set mankind free. And thus it is to be pursued at all costs. If sheepish mod cons neglect to fiercely and openly denounce the perversities that radicals are attempting to usher in, radicals will triumph by default. Darkness can only prevail when men of goodwill are made afraid to light a candle. It is of paramount importance to remember that acts of the intellect always precede acts of the will. In other words, before we act for a certain end, the intellect, consciously or not, must decide that such an end is the good, the object most worthy of our pursuit. No one sets out to achieve what he views as an inferior or bad end. Thus, in order to win the culture, we must boldly and loudly speak truth, so our fellow men can first recognize what is verily good, and subsequently firmly set their wills on achieving it. If something is true, then we have a duty to say it, so that society will be built on a foundation of rock instead of a foundation of sand. Be reminded that there is no such thing as an intrinsically hateful truth. Motive is always a deciding factor in analyzing the morality of a seemingly harsh statement. Sometimes charity and prudence dictate that one should even call his own mother fat. Perhaps she is a diabetic or has heart disease, and hearing such a hard truth will allow her to reformulate her diet and add years to her life. More important yet, perhaps she is a glutton, needing chastisement against a habituated mortal sin. Similarly, we do no one any favors when we, out of fear of being slandered as racist, sexist, jingoistic, homophobic, intolerant, or hateful, or any other empty, radical scare words, consent to hide the light of unpopular truths under a bushel basket. When we fail to acknowledge sensitive truths, e.g., that contemporary American black fatherlessness is linked with their disproportionately high crime rates, that single motherhood is ruinous for children, that unchecked immigration is undermining the fabric of American culture, that homosexual relations are vile, depraved, hateful acts, that men can't actually become women, and vice versa, we shortchange our fellow man, since we deprive him of the opportunity to reform his life to bring it into harmony with right order. Hard sayings must be shouted loudly for the benefit of all mankind. Damn the consequences. Moreover, if retrogrades band together and resolve to be undeterred in our vocalization of unpopular truths, it will be impossible for big media and big business to ostracize us. The corporate goons in human resources won't be able to fire all of us. It's impossible to effectively silence such a significant segment of the population. The story of the emperor's new clothes serves as an uncannily apropos allegory for modern man's affinity for shrinking from his duty to proclaim truth. In the fable, the emperor is duped by two shysters into purchasing imaginary clothes, so that when he gets dressed in his new attire, in reality he's naked. Despite the fact that the emperor is humiliating himself by strutting around the town square in a full state of undress, none of the emperor's men or townspeople, for fear of appearing foolish or insolent, will speak out to tell the emperor that his wardrobe is a fraud. The people uniformly tickle the emperor's ear, complimenting his splendid linens and refined sartorial taste, except one little boy out of the whole town sees the emperor and, with umbrage in his voice, exclaims, "But the emperor isn't wearing any clothes! He's naked!" In the aftermath of this one child's naive candor, the people come to their senses and soberly admit the obvious. Truly, the emperor is not wearing any clothes. The weakness of mankind is such that the majority are content to go along with a lie out of fear of blowback should they stand and fight for truth. It's a somber realization that most people are consequentialists who would rather pretend a naked emperor is dressed in fine linen rather than risk looking foolish, or worse yet, risk a stint in the dungeon. At the same time, we should take solace that a lone voice, even that of a child, bravely crying out in the wilderness, is often sufficient to call men to their senses, to call men away from mass delusion. Be the lone voice in your locale, and soon we will marshal a network of woke retrogrades, ready to turn the tides of a war we've been long losing. The only precondition for the death of the gospel is silence. Never be cowed. Always speak truth, especially when it's unpopular. Hold fast to the musings of George Washington. I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man.
And that was Rule 3 from Rules for Retrogrades. And he's got a good point here. He doesn't go much into details, unfortunately. I would suggest, as I have done many times, that if you want to practice, the best place to do it is on social media. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, 5 minutes of the chapter that we started last week from Ideas Have Consequences.
That socialism is in origin a middle class and not a proletarian concept. The middle class owes to its social location an especial fondness for security and complacency. Protected on either side by classes which must absorb shocks, it would forget the hazards of existence. The lower class, close to the reality of need, develops a manly fortitude and is sometimes touched with nobility in the face of its precariousness. The upper class bears responsibility and cannot avoid leading a life of drama because much is put into its hands. Lightnings of favor or of discontent flash in its direction, and he at the top of the hierarchy, whether it rests on true values or not, knows that he is playing for his head. In between lies the besotted middle class, grown enormous under the new orientation of Western man, loving comfort, risking little, terrified by the thought of change. Its aim is to establish a materialistic civilization which will banish threats to its complacency. It has conventions, not ideals. It is washed rather than clean. The plight of Europe today is the direct result of the bourgeois ascendancy and its corrupted worldview. Thus, the final degradation of the Baconian philosophy is that knowledge becomes power in the service of appetite. The state, ceasing to express man's inner qualifications, turns into a vast bureaucracy designed to promote economic activity. It is little wonder that traditional values, however much they may be eulogized on commemorative occasions, today must dodge about and find themselves nooks and crannies, if they are to survive at all. Burke's remarked that the state is not a partnership in things subservient only to gross animal existence now seems as antiquated as his tribute to chivalry. Upholders of tradition habitually classify the forces menacing our institutions as subversive activity. The description is just. There is often in the language of ordinary people a logic which, for want of philosophy, they cannot interpret. And so is there here, for it can be shown that subversive activity has an exact application. Indeed, it would be difficult to find a more accurate phrase. The expression means plainly an inversion by which matter is placed over spirit or quantity placed over quality. Thus it describes perfectly what it is usually employed to describe, the various forms of collectivism which rest on a materialistic philosophy. The dullest member of a conservative legislative committee, seeking the source of threats to institutions, does not fail to see that those doctrines which exalt material interests over spiritual, to the confounding of rational distinctions among men, are positively incompatible with the society he is elected to represent. For expressing such views, he is likely to be condemned as ignorant or selfish, because normally he does not express them very well. Let us therefore find him a gifted spokesman. Here is Shakespeare on the subject of subversive activity. Oh, when degree is shaked, which is the ladder to all high designs, then enterprise is sick. How could communities, degrees in schools and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogenity and due of birth, prerogative of age, crowns, scepters, laurels, but by degree stand in authentic place. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores, and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should be lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose endless jar justice resides.
And that was a little bit of Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Trust but verify. First off, don't let the force of the impression carry you away. Say to it, hold up a bit and let me see who you are and where you are from. Let me put you to the test. Epictetus, Discourses 2.18.24. One of the wonders of your mind is the quickness with which it can comprehend and categorize things. As Malcolm Gladwell wrote in Blink, we are constantly making split-second decisions based on years of experience and knowledge, as well as using the same skill to confirm prejudices, stereotypes, and assumptions. Clearly, the former thinking is a source of strength, whereas the latter is a great weakness. We lose very little by taking a beat to consider our own thoughts. Is this really so bad? What do I really know about this person? Why do I have such strong feelings here? Is anxiety really adding much to the situation? What's so special about blank? By asking these questions, by putting our impressions to the test, as Epictetus recommends, we're less likely to be carried away by them or make a move on a mistaken or biased one. We're still free to use our instincts, but we should always, as the Russian proverb says, trust but verify.
And that was the Daily Stoic. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Where's the first demon that Jesus confronts in the first gospel? In church. So, church people, listening to me right now, lest we think, we're kind of above the fray. Devils love to hang out in churches. They always have. They love dividing, causing trouble and dissension within the church. Don't be surprised that some of the greatest work being done by the dark powers take place within churches.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, racism is the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. It is the notion of ascribing moral, social, or political significance to a man's genetic lineage. The notion that a man's intellectual and characterological traits are produced and transmitted by his internal body chemistry, which means, in practice, that a man is to be judged not by his own character and actions, but by the characters and actions of a collective of ancestors. Unquote. That was Ayn Rand from the chapter Racism from the book The Virtue of Selfishness. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 strategies of war.
In 1961, when President Charles de Gaulle of France faced a vicious right-wing terror campaign by French forces in Algeria opposed to his plan to grant the colony its independence, he used a similar strategy. He appeared on television to say that the French could not surrender to this campaign and that the costs in lives were relatively small compared to what they had recently suffered in World War II, that the terrorists were few in number, and that to defeat them, the French must not succumb to panic, but must simply unite. In both these cases, a leader was able to provide a steadying influence, a ballast against the latent hysteria felt by the threatened citizenry and stoked by the media. The threat was real, Churchill and de Gaulle acknowledged. Security measures were being taken, but the important thing was to channel public emotions away from fear and into something positive. The leaders turned the attacks into rallying points, using them to unite a fractured public. A crucial issue, where polarization is always a goal of terrorism. Instead of trying to mount a dramatic counterstrike, Churchill and de Gaulle included the public in their strategic thinking and made the citizenry active participants in the battle against these destructive forces. While working to halt the psychological damage from an attack, the leader must do everything possible to thwart a further strike. Terrorists often work sporadically and with no pattern, partly because unpredictability is frightening, partly because they are often in fact too weak to mount a sustained effort. Time must be taken to patiently uproot the terrorist threat. More valuable than military force here is solid intelligence, infiltration of the enemy ranks, working to find dissidents from within, and slowly and steadily drying up the money and resources on which the terrorist depends.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. As far as my YouTube listeners are concerned, I'm still working on getting everything squared away. It seems as though I've gone ahead and I'm able to manually hook up the RSS feed. So now it's just a matter of the system doing its thing and uploading the episodes Thursday and Friday. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because psychological internalization is one of the central topological shifts of violence in modernity. Violence occurs in the form of a conflict within the psyche. Destructive tensions are born internally rather than discharged externally. The front is no longer located outside the ego, but within it. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it like a garrison in a conquered city. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the second half of the chapter that we started last week from Rules for Radicals, 24 minutes long.
In a world where good is a value dependent on whether we want it. In the world as it is, the solution of each problem inevitably creates a new one. In the world as it is, there are no permanent happy or sad endings. Such endings belong to the world of fantasy. The world as we would like it to be. The world of children's fairy tales, where they lived happily ever after. In the world as it is, the stream of events surges endlessly onward with death as the only terminus. One never reaches the horizon. It is always just beyond, ever beckoning onward. It is the pursuit of life itself. This is the world as it is. This is where you start. It is not a world of peace and beauty and dispassionate rationality, but as Henry James once wrote, life is, in fact, a battle. Evil is insolent and strong, beauty enchanting but rare, goodness very apt to be weak, folly very apt to be defiant, wickedness to carry the day, imbeciles to be in great places, people of sense in small, and mankind generally unhappy. But the world as it stands is no narrow illusion, no phantasm, no evil dream of the night. We wake up to it again forever and ever, and we can neither forget it, nor deny it, nor dispense with it. Henry James's statement is an affirmation of that of Job. The life of man upon earth is a warfare. Disraeli put it succinctly. Political life must be taken as you find it. Once we have moved into the world as it is, then we begin to shed fallacy after fallacy. The prime illusion we must rid ourselves of is the conventional view in which things are seen separate from their inevitable counterparts. We know intellectually that everything is functionally interrelated, but in our operations we segment and isolate all values and issues. Everything about us must be seen as the indivisible partner of its converse, light and darkness, good and evil, life and death. From the moment we are born, we begin to die. Happiness and misery are inseparable. So are peace and war. The threat of destruction from nuclear energy conversely carries the opportunity of peace and plenty. And so, with every component of this universe, all is paired in this enormous Noah's Ark of life. Life seems to lack rhyme or reason, or even a shadow of order, unless we approach it with the key of converses. Seeing everything in its duality, we begin to get some dim clues to direction and what it's all about. It is in these contradictions and their incessant interacting tensions that creativity begins. As we begin to accept the concept of contradictions, we see every problem or issue in its whole interrelated sense. We then recognize that for every positive, there is a negative, and that there is nothing positive without its concomitant negative, nor any political paradise without its negative side. For more than 4,000 years, the Chinese have been familiar with the principle of complementarity in their philosophical life. They believe that from the illimitable, nature, God or gods, came the principle of creation, which they called the great extreme. And from the great extreme came the two principles, or dual powers, yang and yin, out of which came everything else. Yang and yin have been defined as positive and negative, light and darkness, male and female, or numerous other examples of opposites or converses. Niels Bohr pointed out that the appearance of contradictions was a signal that the experiment was on the right track. There is not much hope if we have only one difficulty, but when we have two, we can match them off against each other. Bohr called this complementarity, meaning that the interplay of seemingly conflicting forces or opposites is the actual harmony of nature. Whitehead similarly observed, in formal logic, a contradiction is the signal of a defeat, but in the evolution of real knowledge, it marks the first step in progress towards a victory. Everywhere you look, all change shows this complementarity. In Chicago, the people of Upton Sinclair's jungle, then the worst slum in America, crushed by starvation wages when they worked, demoralized, diseased, living in rotting shacks, were organized. Their banners proclaimed equality for all races, job security, and a decent life for all. With their power, they fought and won. Today, as part of the middle class, they are also part of our racist, discriminatory culture. The Tennessee Valley Authority was one of the prize jewels in the Democratic crown. Visitors came from every part of the world to see, admire, and study this physical and social achievement of a free society. Today, it is the scourge of the Cumberland Mountains, strip mining for coal and wreaking havoc on the countryside. The CIO was the militant champion of America's workers. In its ranks, directly and indirectly, were all of America's radicals. They fought the corporate structure of the nation and won. Today, merged with the AF of L, it is an entrenched member of the establishment, and its leader supports the war in Vietnam. Another example is today's high-rise public housing projects. Originally conceived and carried through as major advances in ridding cities of slums, they involved the tearing down of rotting, rat-infested tenements and the erection of modern apartment buildings. They were acclaimed as America's refusal to permit its people to live in the dirty shambles of the slums. It is common knowledge that they have turned into jungles of horror and now confront us with the problem of how we can either convert or get rid of them. They have become compounds of double segregation on the bases of both economy and race, and a danger for anyone compelled to live in these projects. A beautiful, positive dream has grown into a negative nightmare. It is the universal tale of revolution and reaction. It is the constant struggle between the positive and its converse negative, which includes the reversal of roles so that the positive of today is the negative of tomorrow, and vice versa. This view of nature recognizes that reality is dual. The principles of quantum mechanics in physics apply even more dramatically to the mechanics of mass movements. This is true not only in complementarity, but in the repudiation of the hitherto universal concept of causality, whereby matter and physics were understood in terms of cause and effect, where for every effect there had to be a cause, and one always produced the other. In quantum mechanics, causality was largely replaced by probability. An electron or atom did not have to do anything specific in response to a particular force. There was just a set of probabilities that it would react in this or that way. This is fundamental in the observations and propositions which follow. At no time in any discussion or analysis of mass movements, tactics, or any other phase of the problem can it be said that if this is done, then that will result. The most we can hope to achieve is an understanding of the probabilities consequent to certain actions. This grasp of the duality of all phenomena is vital in our understanding of politics. It frees one from the myth that one approach is positive and another negative. There is no such thing in life. One man's positive is another man's negative. The description of any procedure as positive or negative is the mark of a political illiterate. Once the nature of revolution is understood from the dualistic outlook, we lose our mono-view of a revolution and see it coupled with its inevitable counter-revolution. Once we accept and learn to anticipate the inevitable counter-revolution, we may then alter the historical pattern of revolution and counter-revolution from the traditional slow advance of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward to minimizing the latter. Each element with its positive and converse sides is fused to other related elements in an endless series of everything, so that the converse of revolution on one side is counter-revolution, and on the other side, reformation, and so on in an endless chain of connected converses. Class distinctions, the Trinity. The setting for the drama of change has never varied. Mankind has been and is divided into 3 parts: the haves, the have-nots, and the have-a-little want-mores. On top are the haves with power, money, food, security, and luxury. They suffocate in their surpluses, while the have-nots starve. Numerically, the haves have always been the fewest. The haves want to keep things as they are and are opposed to change. Thermopolitically, they are cold and determined to freeze the status quo. On the bottom are the world's have-nots. On the world scene, they are by far the greatest in numbers. They are chained together by the common misery of poverty, rotten housing, disease, ignorance, political impotence, and despair. When they are employed, their jobs pay the least, and they are deprived in all areas basic to human growth. Caged by color, physical or political, they are barred from an opportunity to represent themselves in the politics of life. The haves want to keep, the have-nots want to get. Thermopolitically, they are a mass of cold ashes of resignation and fatalism. But inside, there are glowing embers of hope, which can be fanned by the building of means of obtaining power. Once the fever begins, the flame will follow. They have nowhere to go but up. They hate the establishment of the haves, with its arrogant opulence, its police, its courts, and its churches. Justice, morality, law, and order are mere words when used by the haves, which justify and secure their status quo. The power of the have-nots rests only with their numbers. It has been said that the haves, living under the nightmare of possible threats to their possessions, are always faced with the question of, when do we sleep? While the perennial question of the have-nots is, when do we eat? The cry of the have-nots has never been, give us your hearts, but always, get off our backs. they ask not for love, but for breathing space. Between the haves and have-nots are the have-a-little, want-mores, the middle class, torn between upholding the status quo to protect the little they have, yet wanting change so they can get more. They become split personalities. They could be described as social, economic, and political schizoids. Generally, they seek the safe way, where they can profit by change and yet not risk losing the little they have. They insist on a minimum of 3 aces before playing a hand in the poker game of revolution. Thermopolitically, they are tepid and rooted in inertia. Today, in Western society, and particularly in the United States, they comprise the majority of our population. Yet, in the conflicting interests and contradictions within the have-a-little, want-mores, is the genesis of creativity. Out of this class have come, with few exceptions, the great world leaders of change of the past centuries: Moses, Paul of Tarsus, Martin Luther, Robespierre, Georges Danton, Samuel Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Napoleon Bonaparte, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Nikolai Lenin, Mahatma Gandhi, Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, and others. Just as the clash of interests within the have-a-little, want-mores has bred so many of the great leaders, it has also spawned a particular breed stalemated by cross-interests into inaction. These do-nothings profess a commitment to social change for ideals of justice, equality, and opportunity, and then abstain from and discourage all effective action for change. They are known by their brand. I agree with your ends, but not your means. They function as blankets, whenever possible, smothering sparks of dissension that promise to flare up into the fire of action. These do-nothings appear publicly as good men, humanitarian, concerned with justice and dignity. In practice, they are invidious. They are the ones Edmund Burke referred to when he said acidly, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Both the revolutionary leaders, or the doers, and the do-nothings will be examined in these pages. The history of prevailing status quos shows decay and decadence infecting the opulent materialism of the haves. The spiritual life of the haves is a ritualistic justification of their possessions. More than 100 years ago, Tocqueville commented, as did other students of America at that time, that self-indulgence accompanied by concern for nothing except personal materialistic welfare was the major menace to America's future. Whitehead noted in Adventures of Ideas that the enjoyment of power is fatal to the subtleties of life. Ruling classes degenerate by reason of their lazy indulgence in obvious gratifications. In such a state, men may be said to fall asleep, for it is in sleep that we each turn away from the world about us to our private worlds. As Heraclitus said in Fragments, the waking have one world in common. Sleepers have each a private world of his own. I must quote one more book pertinent to this subject. In Alice in Wonderland, Tiger Lily explains about the talking flowers to Alice. Tiger Lily points out that the flowers that talk grow out of hard beds of ground, and in most gardens, Tiger Lily says, they make the beds too soft, so that the flowers are always asleep. It is as though the great law of change had prepared the anesthetization of the victim prior to the social surgery to come. Change means movement. Movement means friction. Only in the frictionless vacuum of a non-existent abstract world can movement or change occur without that abrasive friction of conflict. In these pages, it is our open political purpose to cooperate with the great law of change. To want otherwise would be like King Canute's commanding the tides and waves to cease. a word about my personal philosophy. It is anchored in optimism. It must be, for optimism brings with it hope, a future with a purpose, and therefore a will to fight for a better world. Without this optimism, there is no reason to carry on. If we think of the struggle as a climb up a mountain, then we must visualize a mountain with no top. We see a top, but when we finally reach it, the overcast rises and we find ourselves merely on a bluff. The mountain continues on up. Now we see the real top ahead of us and strive for it, only to find we've reached another bluff, the top still above us, and so it goes on interminably. Knowing that the mountain has no top, that it is a perpetual quest from plateau to plateau, the question arises, why the struggle, the conflict, the heartbreak, the danger, the sacrifice? Why the constant climb? Our answer is the same as that which a real mountain climber gives when he is asked why he does what he does. Because it's there. Because life is there ahead of you, and either one tests oneself in its challenges or huddles in the valleys in a dreamless day-to-day existence, whose only purpose is the preservation of an illusory security and safety. The latter is what the vast majority of people choose to do, fearing the adventure into the unknown. Paradoxically, they give up the dream of what may lie ahead on the heights of tomorrow for a perpetual nightmare, an endless succession of days fearing the loss of a tenuous security. Unlike the chore of the mythic Sisyphus, this challenge is not an endless pushing up of a boulder to the top of a hill, only to have it roll back again, the chore to be repeated eternally. It is pushing the boulder up an endless mountain. But, unlike Sisyphus, we are always going further upward. And also, unlike Sisyphus, each stage of the trail upward is different, newly dramatic, an adventure each time. At times, we do fall back and become discouraged. But it is not that we are making no progress. Simply, this is the very nature of life, that it is a climb, and that the resolution of each issue in turn creates other issues, born of plights which are unimaginable today. The pursuit of happiness is never ending. Happiness lies in the pursuit. Confronted with the materialistic decadence of the status quo, one should not be surprised to find that all revolutionary movements are primarily generated from spiritual values and considerations of justice, equality, peace, and brotherhood. History is a relay of revolutions. The torch of idealism is carried by the revolutionary group until this group becomes an establishment, and then quietly the torch is put down to wait until a new revolutionary group picks it up for the next leg of the run. Thus, the revolutionary cycle goes on. A major revolution to be won in the immediate future is the dissipation of man's illusion that his own welfare can be separate from that of all others. As long as man is shackled to this myth, so long will the human spirit languish. Concern for our private material well-being with disregard for the well-being of others is immoral according to the precepts of our Judeo-Christian civilization. But worse, it is stupidity worthy of the lower animals. It is man's foot still dragging in the primeval slime of his beginnings, in ignorance and mere animal cunning. But those who know the interdependence of man to be his major strength in the struggle out of the muck have not been wise in their exhortations and moral pronouncements that man is his brother's keeper. On that score, the record of the past centuries has been a disaster. For it was wrong to assume that man would pursue morality on a higher level than his day-to-day living demanded. It was a disservice to the future to separate morality from man's daily desires and elevate it to a plane of altruism and self-sacrifice. The fact is that it is not man's better nature, but his self-interest that demands that he be his brother's keeper. We now live in a world where no man can have a loaf of bread while his neighbor has none. If he does not share his bread, he dare not sleep, or his neighbor will kill him. To eat and sleep in safety, man must do the right thing, if for seemingly the wrong reasons, and be in practice his brother's keeper. I believe that man is about to learn that the most practical life is the moral life, and that the moral life is the only road to survival. He is beginning to learn that he will either share part of his material wealth or lose all of it, that he will respect and learn to live with other political ideologies if he wants civilization to go on. This is the kind of argument that man's actual experience equips him to understand and accept. This is the low road to morality. There is no other.
And that was the end of the chapter of this chapter for Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. I encourage you to listen to your conscience when you're listening to this book, and don't dismiss. When you feel something's wrong, your conscience is telling you something's not quite right here, don't dismiss that. It's easy to say, what do I know? I'm not an author. Don't do that. You want to try to figure out what it is that's bothering you. Two things that I noticed in this chapter is that two big mistakes that he makes. One of them is called subjective individualism, and the other one is called reductionism. So next week, we will continue with the next chapter of Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to trust yourself and trust your conscience.